Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen. Cross-examination with this witness.
Good afternoon. I'm Patrick Lewis from Baker Hostetler for the Legislative Defendants. Good afternoon, Dr. Pegden.
Good afternoon.
We meet again. How long did it take you to prepare your report and analysis in this case?
I worked on this for a long time. So in particular, for example, I spent a considerable amount of time implementing the various North Carolina specific criteria that my analysis respected. The various North Carolina specific criteria that my analysis respected, I think is what I said.
Did this take you on the order of magnitude of weeks, of months? How long did it take?
Are you just interested in the time from which I was first contacted until the case?
The time that you worked on your analysis.
So it's a lot of hours. I would say characterize it as dozens and dozens of hours.
And you'd agree that your goal was not to generate good plans for the North Carolina House and Senate using your simulation approach, correct?
That's correct. I'm trying to generate good comparisons, but not good plans.
And in fact, you've never drawn any map with the intent of giving it to a legislature to enact, have you?
No.
And you've offered no opinion in this case on how much partisanship should be considered when drawing a redistricting plan, have you?
Objection, Your Honor. I think this calls for a legal conclusion.
We'll sustain this phrase. You can rephrase it if you wish.
Dr. Pegden, you've offered no opinion in this case that purports to compare the enacted plan to other possible plans that also would consider partisan effects. Is that correct?
Would that also consider
partisan effects?
I disagree. So recall that in a myriad of ways, my comparison maps are tied strongly to the enacted map. So for example, all the partisan effects of where the map maker placed preserved municipalities in the map, the decisions of whether Town A should go in District 11 and Town B should go in District 12, all the partisan effects of those choices are baked into my comparison set. So in particular, I am accepting a myriad of choices made by the map maker, including some of which may well have been partisan.
But I can't identify as you sit here which decisions were partisan and which were not, can you?
Are you asking me a historical question about the legislature's
the
decisions?
map that you study.
Maybe rephrase the question, I'm sorry.
So you've indicated that your analysis bakes in, you said, a myriad of choices made by the map makers, correct?
Yes.
And as you sit here today, you can't tell us which of those choices was partisan and which were not, correct?
Which of the choices that I made?
That the legislature made.
So, yeah, I'm worried that I don't understand the question, but let me try to answer the question as I think you mean it. What I'm doing, right? So, right, the criteria valorized by my algorithm were those that the legislature themselves wrote down, and then I implemented those criteria in a way informed by how they drew their map. And so, to the extent that partisan considerations affected where they placed any town, which counties they preserved, all of those things I would have preserved. If you're asking me whether I can make a historical statement about which past decisions I haven't undertaken any historical study of their decisions. I can tell you which criteria, as I implement them, could bake in these kind of partisan considerations. So for example, the population constraint, I would not expect to bake in partisan considerations of the legislature. whereas which municipalities are preserved in which districts, I would expect to. Does that answer your question?
What's the basis? You state that you'd expect the decision to split municipalities or not to split municipalities. The decision whether to split municipalities or not, what's your basis for believing that you can predict there was some sort of, or infer some kind of partisan intent in which municipalities to divide?
So I think the entire point of my method of implementing the criteria is precisely so that you don't have to rely on that kind of decision making on my part, right? What I've done is I have simply taken the criteria as written down by the legislature and then implemented them in a way that matches how the legislature implemented them for the actual map.
But if you look at, for example, you're splitting, if the city of Charlotte is split, you can't say if that decision, that specific decision, was for partisan purposes or not.
So that is not the kind of thing I've been asked to analyze. However, like the relevant point here, which is maybe what you're trying to drive at, is that all the comparison maps that I generate would be allowed to split Charlotte because in this hypothetical, right, to give a good comparison to the enacted map. What's that?
Okay. Sure. Now, Dr. Pegden, we've heard a lot about trillions of maps, billions of maps, and atoms in the known universe. You'd agree with me that there's an astronomically large number of possible ways to draw 120 House or 50 Senate districts in the state of North Carolina, right?
Certainly the number is probably very large. I don't know of anybody having conducted any sort of systematic study of how large the number is. That would be very difficult, actually. But let's call it a very large number.
And likely orders of magnitude greater than a trillion, right?
Possibly. I mean, yes, that is, again, quite likely. But just as a mathematician, I'm not used to speculating about things in a non-rigorous way. That sounds like a very excellent guess, but for example, I'm not trying to make too big of a deal about this, but people don't have good techniques for demonstrating lower bounds in the number of ways of districting a state. But you're quite right, it could be much larger than trillions. And my method certainly is not based on somehow believing that those two numbers are close.
Okay. So while a trillion maps or 2 trillion maps might seem impressive at first blush, if we don't know the total number of possible maps, maybe we're only scratching the surface of the number of possible maps you can draw, right?
No, so that's not correct, because so if you look at the theorems that I apply when I apply my analysis, what you can conclude does not depend on the total number of maps. So I mean, a typical example like this is, this is not a perfect example because it's in comparison to what we're doing, it's not a very scientific field. But the field of polling, when they poll people and then give a margin of error on the poll, the margin of error doesn't depend on the size of the state or the country that you're polling. It only depends on the size of the sample. Okay? So that's roughly analogous to what I'm saying here, only here everything is 100% precise. What I'm saying here is that the total size of the universe does not affect your ability to conduct statistically rigorous statements. And in particular, if you look at my theorems, the number of maps is not an input to the theorem. So that trillion maps is still impressive at the second blush. The trillion is what matters, not the total number of maps.
Now, you described your methodology as a third way of determining an outlier.
Yes.
And the third way does not depend on you drawing a random sample of possible maps, correct?
Right, it doesn't depend, or at least, right, to be more precise, it doesn't depend on you drawing a precise random sample in the way that the second method is based on. Obviously, there's still some randomness being used, but it's not the same.
And you'd agree with me that a limitation of a third-way method such as yours is, as we apply to the redistricting problem, that you can't use your method to make claims about the expected range of seats in the General Assembly that Democrats, should get or would get under your sample of maps, correct?
That is correct. That is a real weakness of our method. So, in particular, if some new neutral body was trying to draw a new map of North Carolina and wanted to get a sense and wanted to sort of double check themselves and get a sense, is this map that we made within the range of typical outcomes? I haven't published some range of outcomes they could compare to. Instead, my method is based on detecting whether a given map was optimized for Republican partisan bias.
So while your analysis in this case makes claims about how extreme and how carefully crafted the 2017 plans are, your analysis does not allow us to determine the magnitude of that alleged partisan bias translated to seat share. For example, do the Republicans get one extra seat, or 4 or 8? Is that fair?
I think so. Part of the problem here is, so this idea of counting Democratic districts and which seats you win. This is, for example, something that was discussed in my direct about Dr. Thornton's report. Like, this is not a real concept, right? This idea of taking some historical voting data, which isn't legislative elections. It's some data that we're using as some sort of estimate of historical voting patterns, and then simply counting up seats. That's not a real measure of anything, right? There's no guarantee that any election will ever perform like that, right? So I'm not sure as such that, you're asking me, I can't predict X when X is not even really a real concept. I agree, I can't predict the result of a future election. I can't tell you who's going to win in 2020. If I figure out how to do that, though, I'll give you a call. I'll let you know. Yeah.
You can tell me who wins the Super Bowl. That's even better.
Okay, fine. Okay.
Now, you rely on a series of theorems, mathematical theorems, to make those claims, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And some of those theorems are contained in your first 2017 paper that you refer to as the CFP paper in your report. Is that correct?
Yes. And just to clarify for the record, my report for each analysis, there's a first level analysis and a second level analysis. The first level analysis is just sort of an intuitive thing that you can look at without any math. There's no theorems used for that. It's just reporting, for example, that out of the trillions of districtings, 99.9999% had less partisan advantage. There's no theorems there. It's the second level analysis where I apply the theorems, just to be clear.
Sure. Now, in your CFP paper, applied your theorems specifically to the congressional plan in the state of Pennsylvania, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And later that year, later in 2017, you then testified as an expert witness for the plaintiffs in the League of Women Voters lawsuit challenging the 2011 Pennsylvania congressional plan as a partisan gerrymander, correct?
Yes, I did.
Okay. Have you applied your CFP theorems in this case to any states other than North Carolina and Pennsylvania?
Yes, so I also applied it to the legislative district of Wisconsin for an amicus brief that we filed in the Wisconsin case at the Supreme Court.
That's right. You did tell me that. But no other states?
No.
Okay. And is it fair to say that you also rely on theorems from your second paper, the manuscript that was discussed that I think you referred to as the CFMP paper in your report?
Yes, and just to be clear, all the second level analysis calculations in this report are actually done with the theorems from that second paper. So I specify the precise theorems in the appendix to my report.
Okay. And besides North Carolina, have you applied the theorems in the CFMP paper to any other state redistricting plans?
No.
Okay.
No.
All right. So your CFP paper was only published in 2017, right?
Yes.
Okay. And to your knowledge, that paper was only refereed by one mathematician and one political scientist. Is that correct?
Right, so that's how this was represented. So it's rare that you learn anything about the identity of reviewers. I mean, 2 reviewers is not an unusually small number for a refereed publication. And yes, I was told that the referees were one mathematician and one political. I'm surprised you're bringing this up. It sounds great for me. But yes, that's correct.
And I believe you've testified that your CFMP paper has not been published.
That's correct.
And it hasn't been accepted for publication in a peer-reviewed journal, has it?
It hasn't been submitted.
Hasn't even been submitted. Okay.
I've been busy with this trial.
Okay.
But it's been, but just to be clear, the manuscript was uploaded to the public archive repository, so it's been available to the community. And like I said, I presented it in talks where I have gone through line by line the details of the theorems. And maybe actually this is one more thing just to clarify so that we all understand it. There are math papers that are very hard to read. Sometimes there's a paper, it could take you a week or 2 to understand what's going on. This is not a paper like that. So the proofs that we're talking about fit in less than a page. And a mathematician, especially a probabilist, would have no trouble verifying their accuracy in a half an hour or an hour at most. So we're not talking about, I mean, I'd say a half hour is a better estimate. We're not talking about a sophisticated, complicated, mysterious thing that we should wait decades to have verified.
Now, earlier in your direct examination, in the discussion of p-values, you drew an analogy to drug trials. Do you recall that analogy?
Yes.
And are you aware that in drug trials, a classic technique that's used is the use of a placebo to test the effect of the drug? You give some people a sugar pill and you give some people the real medicine. You aware of that?
Yes.
All right. You never applied your algorithm in this case to any state districting plan that was drawn by Democrats, did you?
No.
Okay. Did you ever apply, and you never applied it to any districting plan that was drawn by a nonpartisan redistricting commission like that exists in the states of Arizona and California, did you?
You're asking me for within the confines of this case, or you're asking more generally?
Well, with respect to your algorithms.
So I did analyze, so for example, in the Pennsylvania case, after the plan was ordered redrawn by the special master, I did, at the request of the plaintiff's counsel in that case, analyze the special master districting, and I did not find that it was carefully crafted for Democratic bias or Republican bias. So I don't know if that's an answer. It's true that I haven't analyzed the judge's map in North Carolina, but that's a congressional map. It's not really analogous to what we're talking about here.
And aside from this plan, you haven't applied your CFMP algorithms to any of these.
So yeah, you have to be a little bit careful there because the algorithm is not what's different. So like this algorithm that I'm running, making random changes, preserving districting criteria, is the same as the algorithm I applied in Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, the special master map in Pennsylvania. The difference is just in how you compute your p-values after it's done. So for example, in the Pennsylvania report, I didn't separate out a first level and second level analysis, but suppose I had. The first level analysis there and here would have been done exactly the same way, just running the algorithm and reporting the results. Remember that I don't use any math papers all the way up to the first level analysis. So if I tell you, this is what I did. I made these swaps. I preserved districting criteria in this way. All my comparisons are extremely close to the enacted map. I did it for 1 trillion steps 32 times, and I found that every time 99.99999% of maps had less Republican advantage. If that's enough for you, if you're already convinced, no math papers were involved so far. It's only at the next level that this whole conversation about when I'm using which math paper is relevant at all. So I just want to make sure that that's clear.
Would you agree with me, Dr. Pegden, that a key component of your approach is ensuring that you are comparing the enacted plans against comparable plans that follow the same nonpartisan districting criteria?
Right. It should be true that the comparisons follow all the nonpartisan criteria. So any nonpartisan criteria followed by the enacted plan, like that is the agreed upon criteria for the enacted plan, I should be wanting to impose. Now, that said, I should say that one of the findings of my analysis is that these criteria, to a remarkable degree, don't actually matter because of how gerrymandered it is. Remember, so I did this robustness check where I used a completely different way of measuring compactness. And frankly, it would have been reasonable for somebody to suspect, well, maybe that will completely change his results. But it didn't at all. And the reason it doesn't change it at all is that the enacted map is so carefully crafted for Republican advantage that as soon as you start making changes to it, right? I mean, it's such a fragile gerrymander. Right? It's like you touch it and it breaks, right? This is what happens with this map. And so one thing this shows, I would say as a result, one of the findings really of my analysis is that the particular criteria, although I did impose them, really don't seem so important to the analysis.
I'd like to display Legislative Defendants Exhibit 155. And we're going to actually pass around some notebooks with some exhibits in them for.
Thank you.
Okay, so you should be able to.
What's the number?
155.
I have it.
All right, you there?
Yes, I have it.
Okay. So you'd agree with me that LDTX 155 are the adopted criteria for the 2017 House and Senate plans, right?
Yes, that's my understanding.
Okay. And you reviewed this document in connection with preparing your report, correct?
I did.
All right. You ultimately used, but you ultimately used criteria given to you by plaintiff's counsel for preparing your report, did you not?
I'm sorry, can you repeat the question? Maybe I missed exactly what you said.
Well, the ultimate criteria that you used to in your report for the legislative plans, that was given to you by plaintiff's counsel, wasn't it?
I'm not sure that that's completely accurate. I mean, I discussed with them some of my intentions with how to implement these, but I was provided with this document. Yeah, I'm not sure. I don't remember an email that came out of the blue after no discussions. Please do these criteria. I don't remember that.
Okay. You remember when we took your deposition on June 10, 2019? Do you know?
That I do remember, yes.
Okay. I'd like to turn to that.
Can I get a copy of the deposition?
Yeah, we're going to pass them around here.
Thank you.
I'd like to turn to the bottom of page 72 of the transcript.
Okay, I'm there.
Okay, good. And I'd like for you to read the question starting on line 24 and going to line 25.
Yes, so the question is, how did you select the criteria identified in section 4.3.1 of your report? And my answer was, the plaintiff's attorneys instructed me that these were the criteria to consider for comparison districting. And I believe here that I'm referring to these criteria that you just showed me, that we agreed were the basis of my criteria. So the way I understood your question is, did they provide me a list other than that list? And that I don't have a recollection of.
Now, you didn't independently study the legislative process the General Assembly used to enact the 2017 plans when deciding upon these criteria, did you?
No, I did not.
Okay. And you didn't study the process for how the North Carolina General Assembly crafted the 2011 plans, did you?
No.
Now, if we can turn back to Legislative Defendants 155. Oh, it's back on the screen. All right, good. I'd like to just review just a few of these with you.
Absolutely.
All right.
I'll just put it on the screen.
So the first criteria requires that the number of persons in each legislative district shall comply with the plus or minus 5% population deviation standard. You see that?
Yes.
Okay. But you actually imposed a more restrictive requirement, did you not?
That's right. So all of my comparison plans satisfy this constraint and even the stronger constraint which the legislature's map satisfies.
Another of the criteria was compactness. And the criteria make reference to the REOC and the Polsby-Popper scores as measures of compactness. Do you see that?
I see them referenced here.
Now, your analysis, and specifically it also states, the first sentence states, the committee shall make reasonable efforts to draw legislative districts in the 2017 House and Senate plans that improve the compactness of the current districts. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Now, first of all, your analysis only evaluated the average compactness of the comparison plans overall, right?
No. Each districting is assigned a compactness score, which is the reciprocal average of its districts. It's not that I'm taking an average over all the districtings of their compactness score. Each districting has a score, which is the reciprocal average of the scores of its districts. And each districting score has to be within 5% of as good as the enacted plan. It's not true that, so, unless I misunderstood the question.
You may,
that's not
yeah,
true.
you may have misunderstood. I guess where I was going with that was, you couldn't look at, for example, the enacted, comparing a specific district in 2017 and comparing its compactness to the compactness of the equivalent district in one of your comparative districts, right?
I could compare the compactness. Are you asking me something about
But
how
that's
I
not what
implement
you
the
did, right?
criteria? No, so what I do is I compute the compactness of every district, and then I take the reciprocal average and constrain the districting-wide score.
And you chose to use the reciprocal of the Polsby-Popper score to avoid a scenario where if you just looked at an average over, say, a county grouping, to keep it simple, you might have a number of fairly compact districts, but then a small number of arbitrarily non-compact districts mixed in. Is that correct?
Yeah, so this is an example that I gave you in deposition in my explanation of why the reciprocal average is, in my opinion, a better districting-wide score than the average. And just to emphasize this point, one way I stand by this choice is with the comparison maps I put in my report. So I think that I stand by the claim that the comparison maps my algorithm generates look like good comparisons to the enacted map they were drawn based on. And that is because I made a good choice of how to constrain this compactness metric. And if I had made a worse choice, the comparison maps would not look as much like good comparisons.
But you don't know if the legislature used the reciprocal of the Polsby-Popper score to look at the compactness of the districts, do you?
So that's right. So I'm not guided in that choice by a belief that they use the same formula. Instead, my goal is to tie the compactness properties of my comparison maps to the compactness properties of the map they actually drew. And drawing on my expertise, I think the effective way to tie the compactness to their map is with this score that I use. And furthermore, perhaps, I mean, maybe this will help. One of the most striking findings to me in my report was that completely changing the compactness metric to something completely different had absolutely no effect on the results. Like whether it took, right, so, and what I mean by that, to be clear, is if you, and you can find this in the robustness checks in my report, run 1, 99.9999978 with one compactness metric would, with a completely different compactness metric, again give you 99.9999978, exactly the same number. So one of the most striking finds to me about this report in this case was precisely that exactly how you implemented compactness had literally no effect on the findings.
But the point of your choice of using the reciprocal was to be more restrictive in the comparison districts you looked at than if you just took the average. Isn't that right?
Restrictive, I think, is not a word I would use. My goal was to tie the compactness of the comparison maps to the compactness of the enacted map in a way, right? And compactness is this sort of amorphous term, right? We all think we know what it means, but actually how you measure it, I mean, people have come up with different ways. I wanted to do this in a way that people looking at my comparison maps, perhaps people that drew the maps, would agree was a good choice. I promise, if I had used the average instead of the reciprocal average, you would be asking me about that, and that would be a much more uncomfortable conversation for me based on the figures that you would be showing me, right? I really stand by this choice as producing comparisons that match.
Now, for your county and municipal preservation criteria, you required all of your comparison districtings to keep the same municipalities and counties whole that were kept whole in the enacted plans, correct?
Yes, as I emphasized in my direct, this is one of the most striking things about my analysis, that I can, in all these various ways, tie the comparison maps to the decisions the map makers made and still find that the enacted map is such an extreme outlier.
Dr. Peckin, that was a yes or no. We're a little on the clock here. I just
Okay, so I promise it will never be my intention to take up your time. It is my instinct is always to make sure that we understand what's going on.
I understand. But the legislative criteria did not require specific municipalities or counties to remain whole except to the extent necessary under the whole county provision, correct?
I agree with that.
Okay. And you didn't run your simulations in this case without imposing your municipality and county preservation constraint, did you?
No. Okay. I mean, I really feel like an explanation is required here. So the reason you wouldn't do that is that the finding that the enacted map is carefully crafted does not require believing that the legislature set out to preserve these specific municipalities. If they didn't set out to preserve these specific municipalities, but I still froze the ones that they did preserve, still, the fact that making the small random changes that I did allow myself to make resulted in this dramatic comparison would still be an intuitively reliable and mathematically reliable finding. So there would really be no reason to do that analysis.
But as you sit here, you have no theoretical basis to believe that the legislative criteria would call for, specific municipalities to be preserved, right?
That was never the basis of my approach.
Finally, we come to incumbency protection. The only incumbency protection criteria that you explicitly imposed was to ensure that two incumbents were not drawn into the same district in your comparisons, correct?
Right, or more precisely, any incumbent unpaired in the enacted map remains unpaired and in the same district as in the comparison maps.
Now, you've testified that you believe that your municipality and county preservation criteria functioned as a proxy for what we've talked about today as core retention. Is that right?
Right. So in the context of incumbency protection, I think that the way I implemented municipality preservation, yes, does do something. I implemented municipality preservation is germane to the question of how the map behaves with respect to a hypothetical core retention analysis.
But you didn't actually run a core retention analysis in your comparative districtings, did you?
This is a question of semantics. The point of that discussion earlier was that you could say that my runs do contain core retention analysis. It's the term core retention analysis doesn't have a specific enough definition, I think, for us to settle a disagreement about this. The point is that in all of my comparison maps, if the incumbent was in a district with towns A, B, and C in the enacted map, then he still is in the comparison map. So that's a completely precise description of how it works. Whether you want to call that core retention, it's that's exactly what's happening.
Okay. So as an example, if I were, if we need to, we can. I don't know that we do, but if I were to pull up one of your comparative districtings of, say, Franklin Lake Senate, and we were to look at one of the districts, and I was to say, all right, this incumbent, whoever that incumbent may be, what percentage of the population in the prior district, in the enacted districting, also existed in your comparative districting, you wouldn't be able to tell me that, would you?
That's correct. And I did not do a core retention analysis based simply on population. That is true.
Okay. Now, under incumbency protection, you see the last, let's go back to incumbency, there we go. The last sentence reads, the committees may make reasonable efforts to ensure that voters have a reasonable opportunity to elect non-paired incumbents of either party to a district in the 2017 House and Senate race. Do you see that?
I do.
Did your simulation method take reasonable efforts to ensure that voters had a reasonable opportunity to elect non-paired incumbents of either party in your comparative plan?
Yeah, so this is a statement that I would argue is, maybe it depends on how you interpret this. If you interpret this to mean so this idea of what it means to have a reasonable opportunity to elect non-paired incumbents, it's not clear to me that this means that you should be trying to achieve a particular partisan profile of the district. Is that is that what you're asking me to assume in your question? Just
I'm not asking you to make any assumptions.
Okay.
I'm asking what did you do?
So what? That's an easy question. Okay, that easy question. Yeah. So what I did is any incumbent which was unpaired in the enacted map had to be unpaired in the enacted map, and moreover, because of how my municipality preservation works, There will be in a district with every town, village, and city in every single comparison map that was present in the enacted map.
So your analysis, for example, would not have, for example, looked to see if your simulated plans were placing Senator Blue in a district, where he would have a reasonable opportunity to win.
My analysis doesn't do anything to preserve incumbents other than keep them from being unpaired, and then carry out what could be called a form of core retention, which is preserve all the same towns, villages, cities, and counties in the district. So I don't have enough familiarity with North Carolina political geography to tell you exactly how that would play out for Senator Blue personally, but that's how my method works.
So to be clear, your set of comparison districtings that you rely on don't actually follow the 2017 criteria established by the legislature, but rather the specific criteria you gave it in section 4.3.1 of your report, correct?
No, I don't agree with that. So you haven't, so I don't understand, somehow these questions were supposed to convince me that I haven't followed this incumbency protection. So in my answers, I've told you exactly what I do. I don't understand why you think exactly what I do does not satisfy this constraint. Perhaps we can get there, but I'm really not there right now.
Let's try it a different way, Dr.
Okay?
Do you agree with me that you are not then comparing the enacted districting against all possible districtings that satisfy the 2017 legislative criteria? Is that correct?
So that's true for my first level analysis. For the first level analysis, I only compare the plan to the trillions of districtings generated by my algorithm, right? And so these are plans, in particular, as you point out, which preserve exactly the same municipalities, et cetera.
But because your criteria that you apply to your report is more restrictive than the criteria set forth in the 2017 House and Senate adopted criteria, isn't it possible that you are not considering districtings that would satisfy the legislative criteria?
No, so the fact that my criteria are more restrictive makes it more remarkable and more outstanding that the enacted plan is found to be an outlier by my method, not the other way around, right? What I'm saying is, even once I bake in all sorts of choices, fine, I'll let you put that town there, fine, I'll let you put that town there, still, just with what I'm left playing with, I can tell that it's an extreme Republican gerrymander, right? So really, I mean, this is the point I want to emphasize. I could, just as a thought experiment, right? So suppose that I made up some new districting criteria that I personally thought was important, like keeping playgrounds unpaired or something, just something that I made up. And I added it to this list of criteria. I'm sure my lawyers are very happy that I didn't do that. But still, suppose that I did that. And I ran my algorithm and I found that the enacted map with those criteria, with this extra criteria that I just made up, was an extreme partisan gerrymander. The fact that one of them I just made up wouldn't matter. All that matters is that I included the legislature's criteria. Anything extra I include just makes it more remarkable and more outstanding that I find it to be an outlier.
I'm sorry to keep returning to this.
No, it's okay.
But because of the stricter choices, the more restrictive criteria that you've selected, isn't it possible that your simulation method could have failed to include simulated maps that do meet the minimum thresholds established by the legislature for the enacted map?
Okay, so I think maybe this is the source of confusion. So there's two. We have the level 1 analysis and the level 2 analysis. The level 1 analysis is not supposed to include every single map that the map makers could have drawn. It's just an analysis about the comparison maps generated in the 32 runs. Okay, so there's no claim I make anywhere, and I think I'm very clear on this in my report. I think I say multiple times, this analysis is just about comparing it to the maps in those 32 runs. On the other hand, When I say that the map is carefully crafted for Republican advantage, that is not something that can be explained by having put extra constraints on which specific towns are being preserved. Remember, it doesn't just work for North Carolina with these traditional criteria, it works with restaurants, right? It works in all sorts of situations. The point is the finding is the map is carefully crafted. And it's carefully crafted even if you imagine that these particular municipalities were chosen by accident and not on purpose.
So I'd like to refer you back to our deposition from June the 10th.
Absolutely.
And let's go to page 102.
Sorry, I've lost the deficit. Oh, no, here it is. Okay, thank you.
There you go. Page 102.
Yes.
And I'd like you to read the question beginning on line 8.
Yeah, so line 8,
102.
102. But you'd agree with me that the adopted criteria that the legislature used in 2017 did not require the preservation of specific counties, correct? That is correct. So you're not then comparing the enacted districting against all possible districtings that satisfy the 2017 legislative criteria, correct? The 2017 legislative criteria, correct? That is correct. I think I stated that in multiple places in my report. I sound just like I sounded now. In multiple places in my report, I am very clear that in my first level analysis, I'm making a limited comparison just to the maps which are actually produced by my algorithm. And there is no claim that this is an exhaustive list of all possibilities. On the other hand, making a comparison to all maps in the second level analysis, it's literally a section heading from my report. Section 4.2.2, the title is Comparing an Enacted Plan to the Set of All Alternatives, and all is italicized.
But it's all possible maps that satisfy your criteria, is it not, Dr. Pegman?
That is true. However, for the second level analysis, finding that the map is carefully crafted, and this is a subtle point, but finding that the map is carefully crafted is not something that can be caused by adding extra constraints. So the statistical rigor underlying this claim, while it might be undermined if I had too few constraints, is not undermined if I have too many, which is part of why I always, in my analysis, err on the side of these restrictive applications of the criteria.
But you could just as easily have run your analysis by following the legislative criteria, except of course for the political considerations, exactly as the legislature prescribed it, couldn't you?
Yes, and while I think that would be a convincing finding that the map was gerrymandered, it would not be as unbelievably, remarkably convincing as the analysis that I've actually done, where I even froze and baked in those choices that they actually made and still found the map to be an extreme gerrymander.
Dr. Pegden, I'd like to turn now to your simulation exercise. And we've talked at length about how your algorithm works by starting from the enacted plan and then making a series of perturbances to the edges of the districts and making those comparisons. And I understand that. But I just want to turn very briefly to the methodology you employ to make those swaps in the State House. And you use a geo unit, correct?
That's right. In either the whole house map or in whole house clusters, which split VTDs, I use geo units.
And is a geo unit a recognized level of census geography?
It's not something that's provided by the census. It's something that is produced in a pre-processing step for my analysis.
So it's an arbitrary grouping that you created through this exercise, correct?
It's not arbitrary. The grouping is chosen by a computer to achieve compact groupings which respect district and precinct lines. District and precinct lines is what I said.
Now, does North Carolina keep election results by a geo unit?
So North Carolina is unusual in publishing election results imputed to the census block level, which means that you can aggregate exact results to the geo unit level without any error at all from the legislature's estimation of the census block level data.
So are you saying then that election returns are calculated, are kept by the state of North Carolina at the census block level?
No, the word I used was imputed. So the or I don't know who does it for them, but the legislature provides election data at the census block level. So even though votes are tabulated in VTDs, data is provided by the legislature's website as being the data that is used when the legislature draws maps at the census block level. And so the voting data is simply, you imagine you split up the votes among the census blocks, making up a VTD proportionally. So in particular, when doing the analysis of the state of North Carolina, unlike in most states, you have access to voting data at the census block data level, which is endorsed by the legislature. And just to clarify, because maybe this was the source of your question, I'm not saying that the votes are tabulated at this level, but the legislature does the job for you of imputing vote counts to the census blocks from the VTD level.
So you do both a statewide and a county grouping analysis in each of the House and the Senate. And so I'm going to ask you some questions to start with your statewide analysis. First, are you aware that plaintiffs in this lawsuit are not challenging every single House and Senate district?
Yes.
Okay. And you did an attempt to freeze the districts for purposes of your statewide analysis that the plaintiffs are not challenging, correct?
No, I did not.
Now, you did freeze the special master districts, but I'm referring.
Yeah, and I should clarify, actually, even though I said yes 2 questions ago, I don't actually know exactly what's being challenged. So it's my understanding that, right, so I was asked to do analyses of specific clusters. That was the basis for answering that question that way. Okay. So I don't actually know the full extent of what's being challenged. I haven't been part of those conversations.
Okay. So for your statewide analysis, would you agree with me that we have no way of separating the impact of alleged partisan bias from districts that the plaintiffs aren't challenging compared to those that the plaintiffs are challenging?
So I don't know. So are you making a representation to me about how many districts are being challenged or not? So it would depend. There are situations in which you would be able to tell something depending on what these not challenged districts were. So for example, if they were single district clusters, then yes, you would be able to tell. So without knowing more about the situation, I'm reluctant to give an expert opinion on whether you would be able to still use my analysis for the question that you're asking.
You then did county grouping analyses of specific county groupings that the plaintiffs asked you to review, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Did you analyze any county groupings at the group level that plaintiffs did not ask you to analyze?
No, these are all the analyses that I prepared for this trial are in my report, and it is just those. In fact, I mean, you can see in my report, I included some groupings even where I couldn't find anything. And I did that exactly so that I was giving an exhaustive list.
So apart from the county groupings that you've testified about today, you're not offering any opinions in this case about whether any other specific county groupings are outliers in respect to partisan bias, correct?
I mean, this is just kind of a weird question because I do a whole state analysis, right? So I am saying something about the whole state. And I'm saying something about just the 2017 districts. And I'm saying something about just the 2011 districts. And then I'm also saying even though maybe it seems excessive at this point, something about all these individual clusters. But it's true that that's all I'm saying. There's not some extra statements that I'm hiding from you about some other clusters specifically.
Okay. And for this analysis, the statewide analysis, you looked at 2 elections, right? You looked at the 2016 Attorney General race and the 2008 Commissioner of Insurance race, correct?
No, so I used 4 additional elections for my statewide analyses in the robustness check section of my report. In total, I used 6 different election results.
Okay. Now, you didn't do any of that robustness testing that you described with the additional elections. You didn't do any of that at the county grouping level, did you?
That's true. I mean, at some point, this report was long enough. But yeah, so I did my robustness checks for the whole House and whole Senate maps.
Okay. Why did you not use a partisan voting index?
So the methods that I used in my report draw on my expertise about what the best choices are. Okay, I don't know if this anecdote is helpful or not, but on the redistricting commission in Pennsylvania, I've actually had an occasion to talk to people that work for the legislature and draw maps for the legislature. And I've asked them, what kind of proxies for partisanship do they use? And they use the same kind of proxy for partisanship that I use. And so that was interesting to me because I chose my methodologies before talking to them, but my expert opinion drawing on my work in this area informs this as the correct, reasonable thing to do.
But you could have used the partisan voting index, couldn't you?
Yes?
Okay. You didn't use the 2016 presidential election in your analysis, did you?
The 2000 which?
16 presidential election.
Let me just check my robustness check section just because I don't actually remember what's there. I don't believe no, I don't have that one.
Okay. But you used the 2012 presidential election in your robustness, did you not?
Yeah, so maybe this line will help you. So this is from the appendix. So yes, the answer is yes. I did use the 2012 presidential election, and this is how the races were chosen. Races were included in this comparison list if they were a recent, high-profile statewide race in a race closer than 3 percentage points. And so in a footnote, I say what a recent statewide race was, and I've listed the races that I considered. So I've given you my inclusion criteria.
Now, you've testified that you, in the primary analysis in this case, you apply a uniform swing to your election proxy, whether it's 2016 Attorney General or whatever race, when calculating the partisan bias of districts. What is the range of that uniform swing that you apply?
So as I describe in the relevant section of my first report, it's chosen from a normal distribution whose standard deviation is 4 percentage points. So that tells you everything you could ask about the range from which it's drawn. That completely precisely tells you the probability distribution of the uniform swing. Of the uniform swing. So it's a uniform swing centered at 0. The mean is 0, and the standard deviation is 4 percentage points. So.
Okay, so for any particular one of your 2 trillion steps along the way, it could be a different uniform swing each time?
No. Each map that you encounter is evaluated across this whole normal distribution of swings, right? So like we gave the example in my direct of this hypothetical cluster. There was like an oval with a line down it, and there was a pink side and a green side. Remember, one had 35%, one had 51%. And so that's just one map. and it will get a score, like maybe 0.678. And that score would represent the average number of seats it would get across the normal distribution of uniform swings that I use. So it's not that the swing is, so all the maps are evaluated exactly the same way. They're not evaluated with different swings. Each map is evaluated across the whole range.
And did you study the range of potential swings in the state of North Carolina to set the range of the distribution that you chose for your uniform swing?
So I'm just referring to my report. Give me one minute. So what I write in the end of the relevant section, this is on page 10 of my report. The section is comparing the partisan advantage of districtings. This is where I describe exactly how I did this. The last sentence is, the random choice of my uniform swing is made from a normal distribution whose standard deviation is 4 percentage points, which is roughly the standard deviation of the swing in the past 5 North Carolina gubernatorial elections. So I think the answer to your question is yes, I did. And that's precisely how I set the range of this uniform swing.
Okay, I'd like to turn now to your, I think the easiest way to do this is with your demonstrative. So let's go to Pegden D4, which is Plaintiff's Exhibit 904. So here, Dr. Pegden, as I understand it, you have map analyzed whole state. That's the whole state using the 2016 election as your proxy, correct?
That's the proxy for historical voting data, yes. But just to clarify, I'm not counting up Democratic districts with that data. I'm doing this.
Understood.
Yes.
Okay. So here, you're concluding that the enacted plan, again, this is your second level analysis with your theorems applied, right?
That's in the rightmost column. The first level analysis is in the middle.
You got it. Okay. So your conclusion is that the enacted House plan is more carefully crafted than 99.9991% of all possible districtings in the state of North Carolina that satisfy your criteria, right?
That's right.
All right. In the Senate, so I'm now going down to the Senate, again, that whole state 2016 data, right?
Yes.
All right. And there, you conclude that the Senate plan is more carefully crafted than 99 point, I'm just going to say 69%,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
I love that I have you reading nines. It's great.
We're all reading
Yes,
nines
that's
today.
right.
All right. But as you've already warned us, you can't actually tell the court how many extra Republican seats that alleged bias translates into, right?
I don't even believe in this thing that you're proposing as a concept. There's not such a thing as a hypothetical extra seat. There are elections that will happen in the future, and I don't promise to know who will win them. There are elections in the past, and I can look up their results. What I'm characterizing here is how carefully crafted the map is for Republican partisan advantage.
Sure.
I mean, if there was this concept, we wouldn't need the elections, right? If we already knew who was going to win each district, the elections would be pointless.
But is it safe to say that you'd consider the 2017 House and Senate plans to be more or less a, maximum Republican favoring plan?
So I don't claim that it is, so I don't explicitly claim that it is maximum in the sense that it is the single worst possible. What I say is that it is extremely carefully crafted for Republican bias, and essentially as much as it's possible to detect, right? Because, again, what I found is that once you start making small random perturbations to the map, almost as soon as you touch it, it's gone, right? Like the partisan advantage has changed. It's not gone, but it's changed, it's fair, and it's never again as unfair as it was to begin with. So it's hard for me, I mean, there's not really a map that can perform worse than it got fairer after one step, right? So at some point, you know, what I'm saying is it's as carefully crafted as makes sense for this analysis that I'm doing.
Now, do you know if the North Carolina legislature used any computer programs that could search the universe of possible maps and identify the most carefully crafted bias map possible?
No, but somehow I think at this point things are a bit circular. This notion of carefully crafted that I'm using is designed to detect somebody trying hard to draw a map for Republican advantage, not somebody searching the universe for a map which is carefully crafted.
Sure. But in your first level analysis, right, I mean, you conclude that the plan is more partisan than, you know, a similarly large number of 999 percentages, right, of bias according to all the other plans you encounter. Now, as far as you're aware, as far as I think we're all aware, Dr. Peggin, these enacted plans were created with the Maptitude software. Are you familiar with Maptitude?
I mean, I know what it is. It's not something that I use regularly.
Okay. So when someone creates a map with Maptitude, they're manually assigning census blocks or other layers of geography to districts, right?
Yes.
Okay. So it's your position then that the legislature, employing that approach, was capable of drawing, we'll just use a Senate plan, that was more biased than, well, I guess you have here 99.6 nines and an 8 and a 3 percentage points compared to all the other plans that your algorithm encountered that satisfied your criteria, right?
Yes, and that's not at all surprising, and let me explain why. Suppose that somebody had come up here and flipped 100 coins and laid them out in front of me. So right now, they're all supposed to be random coins. Some are heads, some are tails, okay? Now suppose that I turn away. I didn't really see them flip them, okay, but they're going to be here. I turn away, and I turn back, and they're all heads. That would be an unbelievably remarkable finding. The probability of that would be 1/2 to the power 100. It would be such an extremely unlikely event. But through manipulation, it's easy to accomplish. Somebody would just have to turn over the coins, one by one. And with just 100 steps, or really roughly 50 steps if they just flipped tails to heads, they could accomplish this thing that would result in an outcome that would be so extremely unlikely to occur by chance. So now we're back to, you wanted to talk about atoms in the universe. 2 to the 100 is more than the number of particles in the known universe. So if this is an outcome, flipping 100 coins and getting ahead on every single time would be less likely than somebody picking their favorite proton and having it be the one I was thinking about right here.
But of course, it's true that the adopted criteria stated that political considerations and election results data may be used in the drawing of legislative districts, right?
I do remember that from the list.
Okay. And your analysis doesn't attempt to calculate, whether, the degree of partisan consideration compared, for example, to plans that may consider partisanship a bit less or a bit more, right?
No, quantifying this is exactly my point. That's what the nines are, right? What I'm saying is that the enacted map, for example, for the Senate, is more carefully crafted than 99.9999983% of maps. This tells you something quantitative about how hard they had to work to make it.
Now, you assert, Dr. Pegden, in your report, that the level of partisanship in the House and Senate maps is excessive, right?
Yes.
Okay.
At least that sounds like something I would say based on what I've done. So if you say that it's in my report, I have no trouble believing you. You don't have to find it.
Okay. When does the level of partisanship become excessive under your analysis?
So that is not, I haven't tried to draw a line in the sand for the court. I see my work as quantifying exactly how terrible things are. And it's not my job to figure out how terrible they're allowed to be. We've seen a lot of 9s in this case. Maybe we should leave it at that. I haven't given a precise quantification. Again, I think that's not really my job. Or, sorry, I've given a precise quantification. I haven't given a legal line in the sand. That is what's not my job.
One more thing before we move on to your analysis of county groupings, Dr. Pegden. Your analysis in this case doesn't consider how much of an outlier the 2017 plans are compared to a set of plans, for example, that don't comply with North Carolina's county grouping and traversal rules, right?
That's not a goal of my analysis. However, there is this thing that we talked about earlier, which you should keep in mind, that when I talk about how carefully crafted something is, extra criteria don't undermine the analysis. So if it turned out that somehow, you just made up half this list of legislative criteria, and so I had a bunch of extra criteria, my finding that the map is carefully crafted would still be rigorous. It would be more remarkable that I managed to find it in spite of extra restrictions on the algorithm, right? Any extra criteria I have is extra restrictions that I would be finding the partisanship in spite of.
So is it your position then that the 2017 plans in this case are more biased than plans that could be drawn in the absence of the county grouping and traversal rules?
That's not a question I've attempted to address. However, what I do address is that even with the county grouping and county traversal rules, the maps are extreme, dramatic, carefully crafted Republican gerrymanders.
But and I apologize to return to the well here, but you can't tell us as you sit here today whether the 2017 plans are more biased than those that could be drawn in the absence of the county grouping and traversal rules. Right?
Okay, I see. Maybe I think I understand your question now. You're asking, in a hypothetical world where we drop some of the constraints, might it then be possible to gerrymander even more? Yes, it's possible, hypothetically. So, for example, if districts weren't required to be contiguous, and you were just allowed to make a district that was 100 completely disconnected VTDs, and you could make all of your districts like that, and the populations could all be completely different. Yes, hypothetically, it's possible that then you could make an even more amazing Republican gerrymander.
If changing the criteria from the 2017 criteria, if it really doesn't impact the outcome, then why change it? Why not just use the 2017 as drafted?
Sorry, what was the premise of the question?
Well, you've talked about the constraints, adding constraints, deleting constraints, changing constraints. If changing the criteria doesn't affect the outcome of your analysis in this case, then why deviate from the adopted criteria at all?
To be more precise, what I said is that additional criteria doesn't affect the validity of my second level analyses. I'm not claiming that my analysis is valid even if I use a completely incorrect set of constraints. What I'm saying is that if I have extra constraints or stricter constraints, my theorems that enable my second level analyses still apply and are still rigorous. For that reason, I err on the side of caution, accepting the map maker's decisions in the enacted map as the baseline for my comparison.
All right. Dr. Peckman, I think I'd like to turn now to your house grouping analysis. We've prepared a demonstrative. I'd like you to turn for it's demonstrative number 1, defendant's demonstrative 1 in your notebook. You got it up on the screen. All right. So let me just orient you, Dr. Pegden, and the court to what we've put together here. What we've done is we've taken a look at the different county groupings, and we've identified, following the 2018 general election, the Democratic seat share, the two-party vote share across the county grouping, and then, as relevant for you, on the far right-hand side, we've repeated your bottom line conclusions. I have, if you don't want to take my word for it, I have all the election data in your notebook. We can turn to it if you want to.
I'm happy to take your word. What am I taking it about?
Well, we're gonna go through a couple of your house groupings.
Okay.
I just wanted to orient everyone to the analysis. So first, I'd like for you to turn to page 2 of that demonstrative. Let me know when you get there. And specifically to the Buncombe County house grouping.
Yes.
Okay, so this is, now this was a districting where you found it to be an extreme outlier, correct?
Yes.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I have to apologize. I'm not sure I'm prepared to accept your representation of some of what's in this table. I was present when Dr. Mattingly testified about Alamance County. I remember it was one of his examples. Wasn't this an example where he talked about a squish districting? And so, I mean, sitting here, my impression was that that was an example of something that he wasn't happy about. So maybe can I just accept your representations of my column?
Yes, I'm not going to ask you about any columns other than your own.
On that representation, we have no objection at the moment.
Okay.
Yeah. So we're only looking at yours, Dr.
Okay.
Peck. I'm not going to ask you about Chen or Mattingly.
Okay.
Okay. So there's a total of 3 seats at play in this particular county grouping, right?
Yes.
And would you agree with me that the Democratic candidates won all 3 in 2018?
That sounds right.
Okay. And would you further agree with me that the two-party vote share was approximately 66%? We have it calculated 65.77.
That sounds right to me. I don't have any particular objections to that number.
Okay. So how can a map that elects, or a county grouping rather, that elects no Republicans be a Republican gerrymander?
Yeah, so we talked about this at length in our deposition, in my deposition. So the thing that I really tried to get across, and I mean I hope it's getting across, is that proportional representation is not the benchmark by which we judge a gerrymander. And so, I mean, I thought about, examples that might help this get across even better. So one hypothetical I'd consider is, suppose that I have a hypothetical state, you can think of it as North Carolina or any other state, that it, has some red parts and some blue parts, some parts that are generally trending red and generally trending blue. There's no reason a priori to expect proportional representation in that state, or even something close to that in a district by district system. But still, sometimes typical maps do tend to give you something close to proportional representation. However, when that does happen, the way it invariably arises is that the red parts of the state go one way, almost overwhelmingly. Like you have red districts which are being won, and blue districts are being won. Okay? And suppose now that I were to gerrymander the map. So in particular, I guess the point I'm trying to make, because it's a bit subtle, is that even when you might hope that proportional representation could be approximated at the statewide level, it will especially not be a good benchmark locally, for example, at a county grouping level. And now suppose I were to try to gerrymander this state with a red part and a blue part. One way to gerrymander the state would be to have typical map behavior in the red part, where people are still winning all the red seats, but where I have, quote, proportional representation in the blue part, which would never happen typically with a typical map and can only be achieved by carefully crafting the map. So now I have so-called proportional representation in the blue part and disproportional representation, so something more like the typical scenario where the red candidates win every red seat in the red part of the map. But you've gerrymandered the whole map, so now it would actually be further from proportional representation. And now, just to tie this up, suppose that the blue people were to challenge this map as a gerrymander. They would invariably finding themselves challenging clusters closest to proportionality in this hypothetical state. And so the purpose of this hypothetical is just to show you that, well, first of all, we should come back to proportional representation is not a benchmark that we should be using for anything. Even to the extent that it is sometimes a rough approximation of what happens at the state level, at the more local level, it is really completely useless. And moreover, you would expect in a gerrymandered map the bluest clusters to be closer to proportional representation and be more likely to be among the challenged clusters in a lawsuit like this.
So then, am I taking from that your suggestion is that the blue area of the cluster might be, say, more competitive than it would be under a map that was not gerrymandered?
So competitiveness is not something that I've analyzed in my report. What I'm saying is that in this gerrymandered map, Republicans, so if you want to tie it to something like Buncombe County, in a typical map, it might be very hard for Republicans to win even a single seat in Buncombe County. That might be how a sort of a neutral map would work. And then you could gerrymander the map so that, well, gee, they now have like a 45% chance of winning at least one seat. That's pretty good, right? Before it was like 0%. Now still, if they win 0 seats, that doesn't tell you they didn't gerrymander it. Well, that election didn't go their way. And none of this has anything to do with proportional representation, right? Gerrymandering the map is not checking whether there's proportional representation. It's sitting down with the partisan data and drawing the map to maximize the political fortunes of the Republican Party. Whether in a particular election there was some sort of proportionality is not really the question.
So then the argument would be then in those blue areas, then you're making it harder for the Democrats to win the seat than if you didn't have a, in your words, gerrymandered map, right? They still win, but it's closer. It's 45% instead of a lower number, right?
What I'm saying, so the analogy that I used it with respect to the Republican Party, but maybe it's equivalent for you. I was just saying that you could imagine gerrymandering a cluster like this to make it as easy as possible for the Republicans to win 1 seat, or make it as easy as possible for them to win 2 seats. I mean, Dr. Mattingly showed a lot of charts about this kind of thing. When you see these things and you imagine how easy it is to get a seat over the line, right? So, and there were these gaps in his charts showing, how the maps were carefully crafted let me not use my term for his analysis, were carefully constructed to have, to put these gaps in the seat vote translation for the districting. And right, it's to achieve this kind of thing.
So let's just turn to one more. Let's turn to one more house cluster, and that's Wake.
Okay.
So we'll look at Wake. It's on page 3, second from the top. Now, in this particular circumstance, you'd agree with me in 2018, the Democrats won 11 out of 11 seats, right?
No, that sounds right.
Sounds right. Okay. You accept my representation that the Democratic two-party vote share is about 63%.
Yes.
Okay. In fact, I believe you even testified on direct examination that one of those seats, I believe it was House District 35, I believe you testified that the margin of victory for the Democratic candidate was 0.2%.
That's right, I remember that.
You do now, or you?
I said, yes, I remember doing that.
All right.
Yeah, I forgot that I got that in there.
Okay. All right, so, under your analysis, then you have no problem concluding that the Wake cluster is a Republican gerrymander, despite Republicans not winning a single seat.
It's just not what it's about at all, right? I mean, suppose that you could go back in time and talk to some Dr. Hoffler drawing the maps. And, I mean, imagine, what do you think he would tell you if you told him, but you know what, we lost all these seats in 2018. He would say, well, look, there's only so much I can do. I did as much as I can. I made it as easy as possible for you to win seats in this cluster. It doesn't mean you always will, right? I mean, Dr. Manley gave this example of you have this way of cheating in poker. It doesn't mean you win every single hand, but you're going to beat the house, right? And that's somehow what the game is about. It's not, you can't sort of say, oh, but I didn't win it this time, right? That's not a way to look at whether the map was gerrymandered.
I'd just like to turn very briefly to your demonstrative D6, if we could go there. So, Dr. Pegden, just to tie this off, for these four, and for the record, what we're referring to now are the House clusters: Gaston, Cleveland, Richmond, Montgomery, etc., Person, Vance, Granville, and Warren, and then Frank, Ashland. See that?
Yes.
Okay. Your particular analysis does not allow you to draw a conclusion as to whether these are extreme partisan outliers, correct?
That's correct.
All right. And I'd like for you now to turn very briefly to demonstrative 7. We're there. Okay. And with respect to the last two Senate clusters on here, specifically Lee, Sampson, et cetera, and then Bladen, Pender, Brunswick, New Hanover, Dr. Pegden, same question. Does your analysis not allow you to draw conclusions to whether these are extreme outliers?
Yeah, I mean, the only caveat I would add here is that there was some finding for this Lee, Sampson, et cetera cluster out of the 19 maps considered, one map plus the 18 comparison maps. It was the absolute worst one. So, I mean, I didn't, right, so 94.7%, this is where we're getting this question about where is the line. And I'm not offering an opinion about where the line is. I didn't do a second level analysis, so I can agree with you there.
All right, well, thank you very much, Dr. Pegden. I have no further questions.
Intervening defendants, any questions for this witness? State, any questions? Redirect?
No redirect, Your Honor. I just would like to move the exhibits.
Yes.
That's the only housekeeping matter.
So plaintiffs would move to admit into evidence plaintiffs' exhibits 508 through 512, 514 through 544, 551 through 556, 558, and 584. In addition, I don't know whether this is necessary, but for demonstrative purposes only, we move plaintiff's exhibits 900 and 901, 903 through 907, and 909.
Any objection to those exhibits?
We don't have any objections.
Mr. Branch, State of North Carolina. All right, very good.
Your Honor, just one clarification on the demonstratives. In the folder of demonstratives that was passed up to the court, there should have been thumb drives. Those contain the videos that were shown as the first two demonstratives.
I believe we have those. All right, so those exhibits are admitted. I believe 508 and 531 are reports. They're accepted for corroborative purposes. Demonstrative exhibits are accepted for illustrative purposes. Let's see what time. Take a break. 10-minute break. Take a 10-minute recess before we proceed. further evidence for the plaintiffs?
Yes, Your Honor, the plaintiffs, we don't have any more live witnesses. Before we rest our case, there are a number of additional exhibits that we'd like to move into evidence. Things like public records, some deposition designations and the like, materials that I don't think will be controversial, but I just mentioned to the defendants that it's fine with us if they take the evening and look at them. So I'd like to just sort of move these in, make a record of what the numbers are, and then we'll rest our case subject to hearing tomorrow morning whether there are any objections to these final exhibits. That's okay.
That's fine.
Okay, so the exhibits that we will move in are 574, these are plaintiffs' exhibits, I should say. 574 to 575, 579 to 587, 589, 592,
Can you slow down just a little bit, please? Repeat the last one, please.
so it was 589 and then 592, 593, 595 to 596, 598 to 600, 604 to 605, 608 to 629, 635 to 640, 641 to 643, 671, 676 to 677, 678 to 684, 686 to 694, 696 to 714, 720, 758 to 769, and lastly 781 to 785. And just a point of clarification for those last five exhibits, plaintiffs' exhibits 781 to 785, those are ones that we've just marked. Those are deposition designations for five witnesses. That includes Stephanie Hoffler. The parties have agreed to introduce her entire deposition. And then the other four are for interveners. And I understand a couple of the interveners whose deposition testimony we've designated will testify live. To the extent an intervener testifies live, we would withdraw the designations. But because we don't know which ones will get up, we'll prefer to put all of their deposition designations in the record for now.
All right, very good.
Oh, sorry, and there are a couple more that I'm being reminded of. So the 715 through 715 to 716, and then 718 to 719. And I have and will hand up hard copies for the court of the deposition designation exhibits that I mentioned, which are new, and we just put exhibit stamps on them for convenience.
All right, that's fine.
And with that, we rest our case subject to hearing any objections tomorrow morning to those last exhibits.
All right, very well. So we will do that. We'll reserve objections and the admission of exhibits in that group that were just read out to us. We'll reserve that until tomorrow morning. But we'll now, are there matters that we need to take up before we proceed with the defense's evidence, or is the defense ready to proceed with evidence?
We're ready to proceed, and the interveners will be called in the first place.
Very good. So are we mixing, I mean, I don't know, are you integrating your witnesses among each other? So we're not dealing with the intervener's case per se, but we're looking globally at the defendants.
Yes, Your Honor.
That's fine. All right, very good. So if the interveners wish to, Mr. Branch, will you be speaking from the podium? I'm sorry. Yes, Mr. Branch, will you be speaking from the podium?
Mr. Brown will be doing the direct examination of our witnesses. He will be speaking from the podium.
That's fine. Just want to make sure that you would be heard, and you may go ahead and call your witness.
Intervening defendant to call intervener defendant Connor Gross.
If you'll please remain standing, place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Thank you. You may be seated.
Good afternoon, Your Honor.
Good afternoon, Your Honors. My name's Andrew Brown with Shanahan Law Group here in Raleigh, and I represent the intervener defendants. Good afternoon, Mr. Gross. Would you please begin by stating and spelling your name for the record?
Yes, my name is Connor Gross, spelled Connorgroce.
And Mr. Gross, what is your address?
My permanent address is 1841 Curramore Road in Clemens, North Carolina.
What county is that in?
It's in Forsyth County.
Mr. Gross, how long have you lived at that address?
My entire life for 19 years.
So you lived there at the time of the 2018 general election?
Yes, that is correct.
And do you intend to remain living there through the 2020 election cycle as well?
I do, yes.
Mr. Gross, could you tell the court a little bit about your local community?
Yes, I live in Clemens, North Carolina, which is one of the municipalities in western Forsyth County. And if we were referencing my community, I would talk about some of the other municipalities in Forsyth County, such as Louisville and Pofftown to the north, as well as across the border into neighboring Davie County, municipalities such as Advance and Bermuda Run, as well as some of the easternmost part of Yadkin County.
Mr. Gross, why would you consider some of those areas to be part of your local community?
Those are the areas that I've found that as a citizen of the place in which I reside, those are the areas with which I tend to have most interaction. I've gone to public schools, went to public schools for 13 years, and those are the areas from which my classmates tended to reside, and members of the same churches, community organizations, etc.
Are you active in your community?
I would say so, yes.
And aside from your political engagement, which we'll get to in a moment, how else are you involved in your community?
Like I said, I went to public schools, and during that time I was involved with a lot of community-oriented opportunities through the school system, and then since graduating I've served on the Zoning Board of Adjustments with the Village of Clemens, and I'm currently on the Executive Board of Directors for the Davie County Humane Society.
Mr. Gross, what do you do for a living currently?
Currently I'm a full-time undergraduate student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. During the summers, I return home to Forsyth County, and I work seasonally during that period of time.
When you graduate from the University of North Carolina, is it your intention to return home to Clemens?
That's not something that I can commit to definitively, but long-term it is my desire to return to Forsyth County, yes.
Mr. Gross, are you registered to vote?
Yes, I am.
And when did you first register to vote?
I pre-registered on September 15th of 2016. I wasn't quite eligible yet, but my understanding is that the pre-registration rolls over into official registration when I became eligible on my 18th birthday.
And why was it that you pre-registered to vote?
That was the first step in fulfilling my civic duty, and something that I felt as it was the right thing to do.
Did you affiliate with a political party when you registered?
Yes, I'm a registered Republican.
And have you ever been registered to vote as something other than a Republican?
No, I was Republican in my initial pre-registration.
Okay. Do you intend to remain registered as a Republican through the 2020 election cycle?
Yes, I do.
So do you have a preference for which political party holds a majority in the state Senate or the state House?
Yes, given where I fall on the political spectrum, I would prefer that the Republican Party be in the majority.
Okay. Why is that?
I've found that the Republican Party aligns further with my ideology and the positions that I hold politically than any other party, and I'd like to see that translate into public policy that does the same.
Okay. Beyond voting, do you consider yourself to be politically active as well?
Yes.
And can you describe some of the ways that you're politically active?
Currently, I'm on the executive committees of the 5th District Republican Party and the North Carolina Republican Party. When I was in high school, I was the chair of the Forsyth County Teenage Republicans locally, and then now that I'm in college, I hold an executive committee. I apologize. Now that I'm in college, I hold an executive position with the North Carolina Federation of College Republicans.
Have you done any grassroots campaign work with any of these organizations?
Yes, I've knocked on doors and made phone calls for various campaigns and candidates.
And where has that work, that type of grassroots campaign work, primarily been done?
Primarily in my community in and around Forsyth County, and I've done work periodically outside of there as well.
Okay. Have you volunteered for any specific campaigns in the past?
Yes, I volunteered with campaigns and party organizations. Notably, I'm very involved in local politics in Clemens, and then I've also volunteered for, again, a number of candidates and campaigns.
And have you worked for any specific campaigns in a paid capacity?
Yes, I did. My first experience was a paid internship for Dr. Greg Brannon when he ran for Congress in 2016. And later that year during the general election, I was paid by the North Carolina Republican Party to work in a grassroots capacity. And I've done work with my LLC for Senator Dan Barrett when he ran in in the primary in the spring of 2018, as well as Buddy Collins when he ran for Forsyth County Commissioner in the fall of 2018.
Okay. So we're going to shift gears a little bit and talk specifically about your Senate district. Do you know what state Senate district you're in?
Yes, I'm in District 31.
And are you generally familiar with the boundaries and makeup of your district?
Yes, I would say so.
Okay, if we could put up Legislative Defendants Exhibit 179 on the screens, and I believe Ms. Holt will be passing out a couple maps. Wait. Mr. Gross, can you tell us what's on the screen?
Yes, this appears to be the Senate district lines within the confines of Forsyth County.
And can you circle on the map or on the screen there approximately where you live in the district? It's not working. What was that?
I'm in the northernmost part of precinct 072, as circled on the map.
That's precinct.
072.
Now, I notice also on the map there's another precinct, I believe it's 804, that's circled. Did you make that mark?
No, I didn't. No.
Okay. Mr. Gross, let me ask you, what's the first thing you notice about the boundary between districts 31 and 32?
31 features the more exterior part of the county that tends to be suburban and more rural. 32 encompasses the central, more urban part of Forsyth County and mostly Winston-Salem proper, whereas the suburbs, such as Clemens, where I live, which is on the southwestern portion of the county, that would be a municipality that is housed within District 31.
Do those lines track any other political boundaries you're familiar with?
Yes, these are the closely resemble the maps that we use to elect county commissioners and our school board in Forsyth County. So I guess they resemble the urban and the suburban to rural divide that we use to elect other officials as well.
Given your involvement in the community and in kind of the political workings in Forsyth County, is it your experience generally that people in Winston-Salem, or kind of in the more urban parts of the district, are concerned with different issues than those in the more rural parts?
Yes, presumably. I mean, those that are in the more urban part of the county, as you said, are likely to have different issues at the forefront of their minds than a more rural voter.
In your experience, what are some of the issues that you would say are different?
Issues facing the more rural part of the county, such as agricultural issues or issues pertaining to those types of industries, I guess are more likely to be at the forefront of their minds than someone living in downtown Winston-Salem, which is a very urban part of the county.
In your experience, do those issues always break down on partisan lines?
No, I would think those issues would break down more closely with respect to alignment among where people live in the county rather than their partisanship.
Now, is District 31 contained entirely within Forsyth County, from your experience?
No, it also includes all of neighboring Davie County.
Okay. And in your experience, would you say that Davie County is more politically and culturally similar to the urban parts of Forsyth County, or the rural and suburban parts of Forsyth County? Yeah, sorry. In your experience, would you say that Davie County is more politically and culturally similar to the urban parts of Forsyth County, or the more rural and suburban parts?
The rural and suburban parts that are featured in District 31.
Okay. Now, earlier you described that you consider what you consider to be your local community. Do the lines for Senate District 31 respect the contours of that community?
Yes, I think it features a better part of what I would consider my community to be. Obviously, I mentioned Yadkin County as well, which is not featured in this particular district, but yes, I think that it does do a lot to honor that.
Okay. Generally speaking, would you prefer that your state senator be a Republican, a Democrat, or have some other political affiliation?
Like I said in my explanation of my, why I'm registered Republican, that's where my political ideology falls. So I would rather be represented by a Republican for the most part.
And did you vote in the Senate District 31 race in 2018?
Yes, I did.
Did you support the Republican in that race?
Yes, I did.
Do you think it's possible for a Democrat to win a state Senate election in District 31, given your past political involvement in the area?
Yes, I do. And I mean, you look at the parts of Forsyth County that we're referencing. I mean, I live in Clemens, and the top vote getter, Clemens would be considered to be a Republican majority municipality, but the top vote getter in our most recent municipal election was a diehard Democrat, and I was one of those votes. So I think that if there was a Democrat who ran on a position and on a platform that was more in line with what the district wanted to see, yes, I think absolutely a Democrat would win.
But do you intend to support the Republican candidate for Senate District 31 in the 2020 general election?
It'll depend on who the nominees are, and there are other factors that I consider, but I would consider it to be probable yes.
All right, you can go ahead and take that down. Let's shift to your House district. Do you know what state House district you're in?
Yes, I'm in District 73.
So if I could ask for you to put up Legislative Defendants Exhibit 180. Mr. Gross, can you tell us what this is?
Yes, these are the House district lines within Forsyth County.
And does that mark on the screen kind of still represent the general
Yes, it
area
does.
where you live? Okay. The general area that you live, where you live. To your knowledge, is House District 73 contained entirely within Forsyth County?
No, it also includes all of neighboring Yadkin County.
And how would you compare Yadkin County to Forsyth County?
Yadkin County is much more rural and sparsely populated.
Would you say that the parts of Forsyth County that are in House District 73 are politically and culturally similar to Yadkin County?
I would say that they're more similar than they would be with the more central part of Forsyth County, with respect to the urban part of Winston-Salem proper.
Okay. Now, again, we've talked some about what you define as your local community. Would you say that the lines for House District 73 respect the contours of that community?
Yes, I think that they're drawn with the intention to keep the community together as much as possible. Like I said, I would consider Yadkin County to be part of my community, despite the fact that I reside in Forsyth County. So yes.
Okay. Now, earlier, I know you seem to have quite a bit of involvement in Clemens, but most of Clemens is actually in a different House district. Is that correct?
Yes, that's right.
Do you find that to be odd, or?
No, so Clemens is divided into 6 different precincts, and the northernmost precinct, which is the one in which I reside, is 072. But the rest of them are included in what appears to be House District 75. But a large part of Precinct 072 is in the municipality of Louisville, which is only comprised of 3 precincts. And so I think that that's probably the best move, considering, with the intention to keep Louisville as a whole, they had to chop off the northernmost part of Clemens.
Now, generally speaking, would you prefer your representative in District 73 to be a Republican, a Democrat, or to have some other political affiliation?
Given that I'm a Republican, I would generally prefer to be represented by a Republican.
Did you vote in the House District 73 race in 2018?
Yes, I did.
And did you support the Republican in that race?
No, I voted for the Democrat. I wasn't publicly supporting the Democrat, but I voted for the Democrat, Mr. William Stinson.
So who eventually won that race?
Representative Lee Zachary, the Republican nominee.
Would you say that your political and policy preferences align more closely with Mr. Stinson and Representative Zachary generally?
I would say generally, in terms of party and who's more likely to vote with the Republican Party, probably Representative Zachary.
Well, so then why did you vote for Mr. Stinson over Mr. Zachary?
Being as though we were newly drawn into a district featuring Yadkin County, and we were faced with a choice between two candidates, both from Yadkin County. The criteria that I was looking for and the candidate that I chose to support was different than just looking blindly into partisanship. I was looking for somebody that had displayed a devout commitment to including Forsyth County in representation, and in interactions that I had had with both candidates, I felt like Mr. Stinson had done a superior job of doing that.
Do you plan to support a Republican candidate for House District 73 in 2020?
Just like in 2018, it'll come down to who the nominees are, and there are other factors that I consider, but it's probable considering that I am a Republican.
Okay. Do you think it's possible for a Democrat to win an election in House District 73?
Yes, I do, for the same reasons that I described with respect to Senate District 31.
Okay. Mr. Gross, do you know what constituent services are?
Yes, I do.
Do you have any personally, do you have any reason to believe that Mr. Zachary would not be responsive to a Democrat constituent's requests for constituent services?
I have no reason to believe that, no.
Assuming that Mr. Zachary knew that you did not support him in the 2018 elections, do you have any reason to believe that Mr. Zachary would not be responsive to a request for constituent services from you?
No, I don't. And at every time that I've contacted a representative or requested a constituent service, I have never been asked for my party affiliation or whether or not I supported the candidate in their race.
Okay. Mr. Gross, what's your understanding of what plaintiffs hope to achieve with this lawsuit?
My understanding is that they want to redraw the maps or change the process in a way that takes away or that redelegates the responsibility of drawing maps.
Why did you agree to intervene in this lawsuit?
I want to protect the maps as they're currently drawn and keep my community confined within the maps so that we can continue to have a united voice when we need it at the state level.
So let me ask you to assume a hypothetical that instead of the maps as constituted, the districts that you live in were more likely to elect a Democrat than a Republican. Would you feel that you'd been harmed by the drawing of those district lines?
I wouldn't consider being represented by someone with whom I did not align all of the time to be harmful. I don't think that I have the right to be represented by someone with whom I agree with. I think that I have a right to vote and to make my voice heard in every way possible, but I don't think that it's my right to be represented by someone with whom I align politically. But if that right is established and if the plaintiffs have that right, I believe that right should by all means be extended to everyone regardless of where they fall on the political spectrum.
I have no further questions.
Cross-examination.
None.
Legislative defendants, any examination for this witness?
No, Your Honor.
And the state?
No, Your Honor.
All right, thank you. You may step down.
Thank you.
Your Honor's legislative defendants call Dr. Karen Owen to the stand. And now, Your Honors, we have an exhibit notebook to ease with flipping through exhibits for you. We'll pass those
Yes,
out.
please.
Of course, it's Catherine L. McKnight.
Please remain standing, place your left hand on the Bible and raise your right. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony you're about to give this court shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? I do. Thank you, ladies.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon. Would you please state your name for the record?
I'm Karen Owen.
And did you submit an expert report in this case?
Yes.
Let's turn to LDTX 293. It's the first document in the binder we just passed out. Dr. Owen, is this a copy of the report you submitted in this case?
Yes.
Let's turn to page 28 of this report. Is this a copy of your CV?
Yes.
And do you have any updates to this CV?
Yes, I do have 2 additions. Under the awards and distinctions, I've been granted 2 research awards in the last 6 months, and actually one the last month, related to my research on women in politics. So I have received an award to study at the Margaret Chase Smith Library, one from the University of West Georgia to do this, as well as from the Margaret Chase Smith Foundation. From the University? Yeah. The Margaret, it's to study at the Margaret Chase Smith Library.
What is your educational background?
I have a Bachelor of Arts in Political Science where I minored in history. I have a Master in Public Administration, and I have a doctorate in philosophy, a PhD in political science, where I focused in American politics and research methodology.
Okay. And where are you currently employed?
I am an assistant professor at the University of West Georgia.
Okay. And where were you employed before this current position?
I was an assistant professor in political science, public administration at Reinhardt University.
What is your familiarity with politics in the southern United States?
I have studied Southern politics in courses that I've taken as an undergraduate and as a graduate student. I was also a teaching assistant under the direction of Dr. Charles Bullock, and I was his teaching assistant for 2 courses in Southern politics. I have also taught Southern politics at Reinhardt University.
Now turning to pages 30 and 31 of your report, I see a series of conference participation entries here. It looks to me as though you have participated in a series of presentations at symposia on Southern politics over the course of a decade. Is that fair to say?
Yes, I have presented papers and been a lead discussant at several panels at that symposium.
And in the course of your research and work, have you studied politics in North Carolina?
Yes, I have studied North Carolina politics. I've taught about it in the Southern politics class I offered, as well as when I was at the symposium at the Citadel, I presented a paper on North Carolina's elections, and I looked at that.
Could you identify your experience, educational or professional, relevant to your understanding of political representation?
So first, in my...
Your Honor, may I inquire what areas of expertise the witness is being presented?
Yes, Your Honor. We are going to move in Dr. Owen as an expert in the field of political science, including in the areas of campaigns and elections, research methodology, political representation, legislative politics and Southern politics.
Your Honor, if I may observe, at Dr. Owens' deposition, she was asked the question, are you an expert in North Carolina politics? She responded no. So I would object to any testimony from this witness as an expert regarding North Carolina politics. I actually believe that's the bulk of her testimony.
Let's bring up that deposition testimony.
Yes,
Your
please.
Honor. Could we go to page 46 of Dr. Owens' deposition? Dr. Owen, do you see there page 46 of your deposition?
Yes.
Okay. I'm reading from line 5. It says, okay, you don't consider yourself an expert in North Carolina politics, do you? How did you answer that question at the time?
My answer was, I consider myself very knowledgeable in political science and politics, but to say that I'm an expert in everything North Carolina politics, no.
And when you were asked, okay, and you don't consider yourself an expert in North Carolina elections, do you? How did you answer?
I stated, I, with my training and experience and knowledge, have expert knowledge in elections, and those can be used to analyze elections in North Carolina.
Okay. Then one more point, could we turn to page 47, please? And could you look at lines 12 through 17, please? When you were asked, do you consider yourself an expert in North Carolina elections, how did you answer?
I stated, I think that I do know enough about North Carolina elections that I can speak to it with an expert voice and opinion.
So Dr. Owen, when you were asked at your deposition if you are an expert in North Carolina politics, was your answer no?
I stated that I was not an expert in everything North Carolina politics, but I had the knowledge and experience to provide the testimony about North Carolina and its elections.
Thank you.
Let us confer briefly about the objection. All right, so the objection's overruled, but allowing the plaintiffs to restate the objection with respect to specific opinions that they believe relate uniquely to North Carolina or that requires particular expertise regarding North Carolina politics that they wish to be heard on about the qualifications of this witness. But with respect to the list of items that Ms. McKnight read, they're not North Carolina specific, so in general, it's likely that she would be admitted over that objection. But go ahead, Ms. McKnight.
So Dr. Owen, I think where we were was that I had asked you, could you identify your experience, educational and professional, relevant to your understanding of political representation?
So to begin with, if I think about and speak on my academic and educational experience, I have studied political representation. I have researched specifically the concept and ideas behind political representation and what that stands for and means. I have written on political representation and discussed it and published works, and I have taught political representation within my introductory courses to American government, but also upper level and graduate courses, specifically in American government. And then I have researched, as I said, kind of extensively in political representation. It's been a focus of my interest. And then, as kind of the second part, professionally, aside from the academic work I was a legislative intern for the Georgia General Assembly, where I worked for 2 state senators and chairman of a committee. And then I also worked as a congressional legislative staff member in Washington, D.C., where of course I had to deal with issues helping the congressional member with his representation. And then prior to my academic career, I worked at the CDC as a legislative analyst, and I had to talk about different components of representation or look at it within my work as that position.
And now, could you identify your experience, educational and professional, relevant to your understanding of elections?
So again, I'll answer those 2 parts, one on the education front. So I have taught a class in campaign and elections where I specifically look at underlying factors in campaigns as well as electoral outcomes. I have studied through extensive years of graduate school about elections. I've researched elections. Most recently, I've been working on a book project that deals specifically with special elections, and hopefully that project will be finalized by the end of this year. And then I have written already and published books on a book on elections. And so academically in my professional work, I spend time not only studying and researching elections, but I've also taught courses related to elections. And then from my professional experience, as I just kind of reiterated or just stated in the piece on political representation, I've worked in legislative politics as a staff member, and in doing so, I watched the member actually coordinate his campaigns and run an election and what that entails.
And pardon me, I appreciate some of your answers may be similar to these questions, but for the record, could you identify your experience, educational and professional, relevant to your understanding of legislative politics?
So similar to what I've already stated, as far as in my academic profession, I study and teach a class on legislative politics, particularly the class is focused on Congress and state legislatures and what those look like. So that's part of my academic career. And then also I've been an active member of the legislative process, where I was involved as a staff member working for and supporting a member of Congress as well as a state senator.
In your work as an academic, what is your experience with the topic research methodology?
Since I have held an academic position as an assistant professor, I have taught courses in research methods, and I've taught that at the graduate level. And then I have also, as I mentioned at the beginning of my PhD, one of my areas of study was research methods.
Have you studied redistricting issues in your course of study?
Yes.
Have you taught about redistricting issues?
Yes.
And now, in addition to your academic experience, do you have experience working as professional legislative staff?
Yes, I have.
Was that the experience you described earlier?
Yes, it is.
And now, in addition to your academic experience, do you have experience working as a professional legislative analyst?
Yes, as I previously mentioned, I worked for the Center for Disease Control and Prevention as a legislative analyst, and I was responsible for reviewing and analyzing environmental policy, but also preparing witness testimony for congressional members and how the CDC's director or associate directors would present their testimony before Congress.
Have you served as an expert witness in litigation related to redistricting and election law?
Yes.
Have you ever been excluded as a witness?
No.
Your Honors, at this time, we move for the admission of Dr. Owen as an expert in the fields of political science, including campaigns and elections, research methodology, representation, legislative politics, and Southern politics.
Her testimony will be received as proffered, subject to the caveat that we gave a few minutes ago.
Thank you, Your Honor. Dr. Owen, let's turn to the work you did in this case. What were you asked to analyze for your report in this case?
I was asked to review and analyze two different things. One, I was asked to look at and assess political representation and what does the concept and the idea behind political representation mean, and how are voters and constituents represented, and what is a legislative member's role in representing, and what does that mean to stand for a voter or a constituent and also act for that voter or constituent, and then to kind of analyze and assess what that kind of piece of representation is. The second part of what I was asked to do is analyze the State House and State Senate races in North Carolina in 2018 to determine which elections might be competitive elections. And so I was asked to look at competitive elections that I deemed to be competitive, and to talk about whether, or to assess and evaluate whether those election outcomes, what might have determined those election outcomes.
Now let's start with the first question you identified, which is political representation. Did you have a chance to review plaintiff's allegations in this case about representation?
Yes.
What do you recall from that review?
So when I reviewed their assessment, it talked about how voters were harmed because if those voters who have self-identified as one partisan preference, then they would not be fully represented, or they were not represented if their member of the General Assembly, whether a representative in the House or a senator, was of another party affiliation, that they would be harmed, and that they would not, their preferences and ideas would not be voiced or heard from those representatives.
Now, how did you go about analyzing representation in North Carolina?
So when I was asked to look at political representation, I first kind of built on my own knowledge and experience of what the idea of political representation is. So I just kind of started with the fundamental concept of what is representation and who is represented by a representative. So I started with that idea, and then I looked and visualized from the standpoint of the General Assembly here in North Carolina, who are these members representing and what is their role as a representative. So are they just standing for a group of voters or constituents? And if that's so, then that first part of standing for is being a descriptive representative. So they might have similar demographic characteristics as a representative. So I looked at first, what does that mean? Does North Carolina's House of Representatives and Senate, do those members then represent the people of the state? So I first kind of looked at demographics and thinking of, like, are members representative of the age of the population, gender of the population, racial components of the population? And if that's so, then the General Assembly is representative of the people because it mirrors the people. It would be descriptively like them. It would be standing for them. And then the second part, when thinking about representation, it's the substantive part. So how are representatives actually standing for the voters and the constituents? So in substantively, are they representing policy preferences and ideology or some particular issue that the voters want? And so that's kind of where I put the framework for representation. One, looking at whether the General Assembly stands for and shows that descriptive representation. And then the second part is where the members just substantively representing. And from that, then I had a discussion about then what fully involves representation. It's not just being like someone or acting for them. There's a whole service component to representation too. So members are not only acting for constituents in the role as a legislator producing legislation or policy priorities through offering amendments or writing bills, but they're also acting for and servicing constituents when they're doing the ombudsman role. And in that process, they would be helping constituents in certain services with other government institutions or public agencies.
And what references did you use to analyze political representation in North Carolina?
So to begin with, in the report, I talk about this concept between descriptive and substantive representation, and that I relied on political scholarship. So what has been written from our founding fathers on representation up through the idea that there's been political scientists who've really defined and talked specifically about these concepts of representation. So one, I relied on political science research and literature, and then other parts I actually interviewed staff at the Legislative Services Commission, the division here within the General Assembly, to learn more about what role they play in helping representatives, and then what resources that members of the General Assembly have to actually represent their constituencies.
And before we delve into your analysis, what did you conclude?
In regards to political representation, I wrote, and I find that members of the General Assembly in North Carolina are representing constituents and voters. They have a designated legislative assistant who works with them, who helps assist by taking phone calls and emails and working with those agencies, and so they are representing constituents who call in and need assistance and help in this ombudsman role. So one, they are actively doing that. Two, I found that in regards to that ombudsman role and serving constituents, and from my experience, I know this as well, that you don't ask the constituent their partisan persuasion or their preference or did you support me. You're working for the constituents because members of the General Assembly are rational actors, and in so doing so, they want to get reelected. And in getting reelected, you can't just have a finite set of voters you're relying on. You want to build your base, so you're going to be servicing more constituents. So that's one part of political representation. I also talked about how here in North Carolina, in the descriptive part, there are more women being elected, there's more African Americans serving. So the General Assembly is diverse. Now, obviously, I think across America, we know it can be much better to be a mirror image of our population, but it has been increasing. And that's, not just in terms of gender or race, but also like professional, how many business or lawyers are in the General Assembly. So that piece of the descriptive part, along with the substantive part, which is not just the ombudsman role I just talked about, but also in the creation and writing of legislation and passing legislation that would help public policy issues here in the state.
It's 5 o'clock. So we'll recess for the afternoon, resume tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.